Welcome to part 2 of our 5-part series on how to complete your novel, where today we're going to complete our plotting step. Here with me today again is my brother Glenn, my favorite plotting and world building buddy. Today we're going to talk about phases 2 and 3 of how we generally like to plot. So take what you like, leave what you don't. There is no wrong way to approach your writing.
Unless you're not doing it.
There's also going to be a free PDF of this checklist in the free tier of our Patreon, which we'll leave a link in the description. Phase 2, step 1, create a timeline.
All right. So creating a timeline. This is going to be broken down into 2 parts. You don't necessarily always need to make both parts, but I like to call them the macro timeline and the micro timeline. I'm going to go ahead and cover the macro here real quick. The idea of this is the big picture timeline. In the real world, this would be human history. In your fantasy world, this might be creation up to where does the story take place. And, on a smaller scale story, before getting into micro, it might just be the history of a company.
Now, you might be saying, I'm not writing an epic fantasy. Do I need a macro time? No. Now, if you're writing something that's not going to be a epic fantasy, you only really need to focus on the micro timeline, which it pertains to typically your main character. This timeline is going to be everything important that has happened for them and your story before the story starts. So this gives you a good background on what is their family like, what are important history events for them to set the stage for your story.
And what's great is if you did phase 1 before moving on to phase 2, you've probably got most of that figured out when you decided who your characters were.
All right, then step 2 for phase 2 is one of my favorite parts, break out the index cards. Now, you don't have to break out index cards. I like them because it helps me get my ideas more tangible and I can move them around. When I first started, I was using just index cards and I'd put them on a table or the floor. Typically the floor, the table wasn't big enough after a while. And then I moved on to a triboard, and now I have cork boards. So I actually have like a whole corner in my office that is just cork boards with my plotting.
Yeah, the table wasn't big enough, and neither were the cork boards. So now we have many cork boards.
Yes. What I do here is I start plotting the story out in layers. I typically start with the big hook of the story. What's the big bad thing that's happening that the hero has to do? I start plotting that out first, and then I'll put in the character arcs and the subplots, and I put them in order. I'm going to show you a digital version of what this setup looks like. Trying to bring a cork board in for the camera didn't work out. So we're going to show you digitally. So you pick your story structure.
Story structure you pick is going to really just depend on the type of story you want to tell.
It's also going to depend on just kind of your preferences. And you don't have to stick to a very strict story structure. I have a loose 3-act structure that I follow, but I don't necessarily work in the confines of it has to be like this. So what I do for my cork board is I start with my index cards where I label exposition, inciting incident, and then complications that lead all the way up to the climax, which will be then to the resolution. Then I start by filling out the exposition. What do I need to know as background knowledge before the story starts? We're going to get into the details about exposition all the way to your resolution in about a minute. So I get my index cards and I'm going to first start labeling them according to my story structure. For me, I do exposition, inciting incident, then different problems. I try to, depending on your genre and your age group, you're going to have more or less problems that are complications that happen, also known as the rising action. And it's going to lead up to potentially a false climax, the real climax, and then the resolution. Now we're going to talk about all of those steps in detail.
Starting with exposition. Now, exposition is basically where your story begins. It establishes the day-to-day and the normal lives. This is the ordinary world, to use the heroic structure example.
It's the status quo for your character, their day-to-day life before the inciting incident happens.
So, for example, Cinderella is living a miserable life serving her stepmother and sisters. And it's not until a ball is declared that we suddenly leave the exposition.
Which the ball being declared is our inciting incident. This is the thing that disrupts the status quo. That's going to be the next spot in your planning where you put your inciting incident. What's the disruption? For example, Bilbo leaves the Shire and Frodo inherits the ring. Cinderella gets the invitation to the ball, and Andy gets a new toy in Toy Story. Next, you're going to list out your problems / complications from the inciting incident And as going forward, you're rising action, building towards that climax, which is building towards the end that you've plotted out in phase one.
Now, you're going to want these problems to build on one another. Even if a problem is resolved, the resolution of that problem should essentially lead into the next problem. How many of these there are, or the scope of them, is really going to depend on your genre. And feel free, if your genre allows, to add more problems along the way. Your B plots could really use some shaking up too.
Now, if you're writing for a younger audience, even like middle grade and younger, I would say you probably could get away with cutting this down to like 2 complications. Now, remember how many complications you have in your rising action will determine the length of your novel. So, if you're writing for YA or older, I do not recommend you drop below 3. And one more thing about problems and complications, it doesn't mean that your characters don't ever get what they're going for, like what they're striving for. Sometimes your characters are going to get it, and then there's going to be a catch. What happens next? And as the story gets farther along, you're going to have less catches and complications because you do need to eventually tidy it up to get to the climax of the story. But early on, give them what they want, but they don't get what they want. And
So, in short, characters finding success in their goals isn't always the end of the story. In fact, it might look a lot more like the false climax. Now, the false climax is probably one of my personal favorite parts of a story because it's a great place to drop the bombshell twists to really just shake up everything that the reader and the characters have understood the story to be up to this point.
And this can look different depending on the genre that you're writing and the age group that you're writing for. Sometimes it's going to be a huge plot twist and you're still going to have 100 pages left of the story. And sometimes it's just an extra complication. On the younger side, Toy Story is an easy example. The toys escape Sid, but now there's the moving truck leaving them behind. So they accomplished the goal that they've been going through this whole time. You think that's the climax, and then quick plot twist. Doesn't take too long for it to wrap up from there, but it helps heighten the tension. Now, sometimes in fiction for older audiences, teenagers and above, you'll get a bigger plot twist. Now, after your false climax, depending on how long you want to bring out the next part of the story, you're going to create more problems, just like you did at the beginning of the story. This is going to start with whatever that complication was. And then you can build on that for some more problems until you get to the real climax of the story.
This is where all your hanging plot threads finally come together. The hero faces the villain or whatever the core moral struggle they've been going through. They comes to a head and they've got to make that choice. Are they going to be one way or are they going to be another? This is where it's time and the story's got to have its resolution.
Now, if you are writing a series, you'll probably leave a thread or two left. But for the most part, all your threads should be done by now. There shouldn't be anything that comes after the climax that needs to be resolved. You're just going to have the resolution. Because, of course, a story wouldn't be satisfying if you ended it right after the climax happens. The readers want to know what's going to happen to the characters afterward.
For example, the hobbits return to the Shire, have to save it, and then finally get to live peacefully while Cinderella and the prince live happily ever after.
And congrats, that's the end of phase 2. Once you have everything plotted out, you're ready to move on to phase 3. And phase 3 is the final phase of plotting.
Now, phase 3, step 1, this is what we call write it down. This is where you're going to take everything you've established in your index cards and you're just going to start writing it probably in a document, like a Word document would be good, and really just start fleshing these things out and really getting the bigger picture and the nitty gritty.
Which leads into step 2 of this phase is scene breakdown. So you're going to take all those events that you had, you're going to break it down into different scenes so it flows together. And the idea is that by the end of this, you don't have to do any thinking while you're actually writing. You'll know exactly what's going to happen in every scene, and you write that down. The advantage to this is when you get to the developmental editing stage, you have very little developmental edits to do, which means minimal rewriting, minimal shifting things around. Now, if you are a pantser, I've heard from a lot of pantsers that this would not work for them because they enjoy the exploration of writing. That's fine. Like I've said before, and I'll keep saying, there's no right way to approach your writing. So if someone is telling you you have to be a plotter, they are wrong. If someone's telling you you have to be a pantser, they're also wrong. You find what works for your brain. So once you figure out all of the scenes, you can kind of get an idea of where the chapter breaks are going to be.
And in these chapter breaks, you generally want to make sure they're ending on an exciting note. You don't want any chapter to end without a reason for your reader to flip the next page and start the next one.
Now we're going to get into the excitement check. What this is as the author, you're going to look through your scene breakdowns. There should be something about every scene that makes you excited to write it, whether it's a really cool battle, awesome character development, some fun world building. There should be something in there that's going to excite you to write it. If you find a scene that you're like, ugh, I don't want to write this, it needs workshopping, because if you, as the author, are not interested in writing it, is that's going to come through and your readers are not going to be interested in reading it.
When it comes to the scenes that you're dreading and don't want to write and you don't know how to make exciting, having a writing buddy is a really good tool for that. Sometimes they're going to throw curveballs at you that you'd never considered and might actually be the solution to making the scene a lot more exciting. But you sometimes have to be willing to give and take and change some of your plans around.
Now, on that, I'll add that I'm a writing buddy through this whole process. You don't have to do it by yourself. I find it's far more exciting with my writing buddy, because bouncing ideas around is you get a lot more ideas going and it's just a lot more fun. Now, if you don't have a writing buddy, I've been there too. You can still do it. And if you don't have a writing buddy, you might be able to find one on the internet. And once you finish your excitement check and you're excited to write every scene, you are done. And once again, if you want the checklist that goes with this, check out the free tier of our Patreon. Link is in the description, and you can get that PDF for free. In our next video, we're going to be covering how to get your rough draft done with some tips and tricks. So if you don't want to miss that, ring the bell, subscribe, and if you like our material, like, leave a comment. It helps small creators like us get noticed.
Also, don't be afraid to let us know what you want to see in a video. Get us more ideas, get you what you want.
And as a quick note, if you've ever read Rachel Aaron's 2K to 10K, you'll notice that a lot of the tips and tricks I have match with hers, because I've took a lot of her tactics and mixed them with my own. So if you want to see how she does it, I'll also have a link in the description for that.
Until next time.